My name is David, and I'm a third generation Sicilian American. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the Sicilian language and my impressions of it. I'm not a full native speaker, but I heard it my whole life, and there are some really fun aspects to it, and I wanted to share them with you today. Sicily and Sicilian as a culture is a great way to grow up. I mean, it's such a colorful thing, and we hear about Sicilian pizza and The Godfather, etc. But in terms of the Sicilian language, I wanted to concentrate on that a little bit today. And to think about Sicily or Sicilian as a language, it's a little bit of a debatable subject. Some people think it's a dialect, some people think it's a language. And what is it that makes the difference between those two things? One of the working definitions of a language that I've always heard is that it's a rule governed mode of communication, either written or verbal, but it has to be backed in some way by a political system. So, in thinking about Sicilian, is it a language or is it a dialect? Has it ever been backed by a political system or has it not been? In looking at the history of the island itself, you can see from this list that it has gone through many different phases, and almost everyone around the island at one point took it over and contributed a little bit to its linguistic complexities. 3,000 years ago, there were three tribal groups that inhabited the island before anybody else did. And they were the Elamians in the far west, the Sicanians in the middle, and the Sicils in the far east. They were eventually taken over by Greeks who were colonizing all over the Mediterranean. And once the Greeks took over the eastern part and the Carthaginians took over the western part, those three original tribal groups lost all of their political power. So their languages went extinct. They no longer had a political system that were backing them. Instead, Greek began to dominate. And even today, there are little tiny pockets of Greek that are spoken on the island. Carthaginian is gone, but Greek has remained. Even after the Romans took over in 241 BC, and Sicily became the first overseas province of the Roman Empire, Greek still continued to dominate there. Latin made some inroads, but it never became as important, at least in the ancient world, as Greek was. When the Roman Empire fell in 476, just prior to that, there were different Germanic tribes that took over different parts of the empire, including Sicily. First the Vandals and then the Ostrogoths. Now, they really left very little behind in Sicily. It's if nobody knew, if you didn't read it in a book that they had ever taken over the island, you wouldn't know it by either the language or the culture. But some of the later ones do leave a significant legacy behind. The Byzantines were able to reconquer, as part of the Roman Empire, reconquer Sicily, and they left behind some Greek orthodoxy, and Greek was continued to be spoken there. For about 200 years, Islam took over from North Africa. The Aghlabid dynasty ruled over Sicily and had different emirates. And there are still many foods and different parts of the language that are reflected in the takeover of the Muslims. In terms of the political backing that Sicilian had, it came in the next phase under the Normans and the Hohenstaufens, who are sometimes called the Swabians. These are people that forged Sicily into a great kingdom during the Middle Ages. And if we think of Sicily as a backwater today, and in a sense, it is, it's a beautiful backwater, but it's not looked at as a cultural center. Back in the Middle Ages, under the Normans and the Hohenstaufens, it was. It had a stranglehold on Mediterranean trade because it was right in the middle of the Mediterranean world, as we can see on this map here. You couldn't go anywhere from Spain to the Middle East without passing by Sicily. And Sicily itself will even forge a little empire between Tunisia and Corfu in Greece, and including the southern half of the Italian peninsula. So under these Normans and Hohenstaufens, Sicily will become important, and so will the language. Many people think of Sicilian, people who know about the Italian language consider Sicilian to be the oldest form of the Italian language, not just a bastardization as it is often looked at today. Sicily had two great kings during this time period. They were grandfather and grandson of each other. Roger II, whose ancestors came right from Normandy, and the ancestors of the Normans came from Scandinavia, and then his grandson, Frederick II, who wielded so much power. He was raised in Sicily, but he became Holy Roman Emperor in Germany and King of Jerusalem besides during the Crusades. Under Frederick, in particular, the language of the Sicilians is going to reach its height, and you have what's called the Sicilian Literary School, where men, scholars, were writing about love poetry, courtly love. And the founder of the Sicilian school, or one of the founders, and the man attributed with the development of the sonnet, Giacomo Dalentini, worked in the Sicilian school or under Frederick's auspices. Right here is one of the most famous poems of the Sicilian school, and Frederick himself wrote a few poems that have survived. The language is beautiful. You can see that it's not quite modern Italian. It's not quite modern Sicilian either. It's a medieval version of the language, one of the earliest versions of Italian in the whole world. And during this time, Sicilian had political backing. Now, going back to our list before, what can we say after the Hohenstaufens and the Normans are gone? They're the Angevins, who were a French group, took over for a little while, and then the throne passed to the kings and princes of Aragon, which were part of Spain. Sicily is going to fall within the Spanish sphere for the next few hundred years, from about 1412 or 1416 on to 1861, when Italy will become a unified country and take Sicily as part of it. But Sicilian is going to lose its political backing, and it will develop. You can either say evolve or devolve over the next few hundred years. There are many Spanish influences in the Sicilian dialect or language, as I tend to think of it. It really is a language. Having visited there, heard the language, having grown up hearing it, it's as different from Italian as Spanish is, and seems to have the same pedigree as a language that Spanish does, as distinct from Italian or any of the other Latinate derivatives. I wanted us to look a little bit at modern Sicilian. And many people who try to define what Sicilian is have a hard time because Sicilian is not a unified language. Every different city state or city speaks with a different accent. My parents grew up with the Ennese dialect from Enna, right in the middle of the island. It was right on the border of the Sicilian and Sicanian borders in the ancient world, and it was almost the westernmost frontier of the Greek colonies as well. So Enna has its own distinct tongue as opposed to Palermitano, which usually is used as the standard for Sicilian. I'm going to be using Ennese. It's a little different. So if you speak Palermitano or another dialect, please forgive me, but also learn that there are many different colors of the Sicilian. So we come across again one of the difficulties of trying to distinguish Sicilian from Italian, looking at the very first word, bello, in Italian, versus in different Sicilian dialects, bedro, or as my parents would say, birro. The double L in Italian becomes a double D, which has this almost the exact same sound as one of the D's in Arabic. And I can't help but think that there might be some Arabic influence in the pronunciation of that sound. But let's go through some of these words. You can hear the difference between Italian and at least Ennese Central Sicilian dialect, or language, as I like to say. We have bello versus birro, gallina versus ardena, uccello versus icido, mollica as opposed to modica, folla as opposed to fuda, basta con sarde as opposed to basta che sardi. Now, those are words that are similar to Italian. The only difference between them is the fact that the double L has become a double D. But many of the words in Sicilian are just completely different. They're not just the same with a different dialect, they're completely different from Italian itself. For instance, if you want to say me too, anche io, in Italian, you say puro gli or i puro in Sicilian. You want to say the word to buy, comprare, in Italian, as opposed to accattare in Sicilian. Everyone knows the Italian word andiamo, andare, let's go. But in Sicilian, it's iere, which is much more similar to the Spanish word ir. In terms of the the pronouns, this is some of the places where Italian and Sicilian diverge the most. You have words like noi and voi, which in Sicilian become nuati and voati, or lui, lei, and loro for him and her and them, which becomes id, ida, id in Sicilian. In Anese, what I always heard was vid, vida, vid with a th, which is a rare sound. You hear it in Arabic, you hear it in Greek, and most likely that's why Sicilian has retained the th. Very few other languages have that. English has it, and Greek. And then the word dove, which means where, becomes uni in Sicilian, which seems to be based on Spanish, donde, and we'll look at that a little bit more later. In terms of a comparison of some Italian and Sicilian verbs, for the most part, Italian and Sicilian are pronounced the same way unless the verb itself is different. But in the first person singular and in the first person plural, the Sicilian takes a distinctly different pronunciation than Italian. As opposed to sono or siamo in Italian, it becomes sono or siamo. The whole emphasis third in the first person plural in Sicilian is put on the first syllable or the second syllable as opposed to the second to last. It's the third to last. So we have sono, siamo, as opposed to sono, siamo. In Italian, to ought to do something is dobbiamo, as opposed to dovremo in Sicilian. To be able to do something, posso or possiamo in Italian, gives way to pozzo and potiamo in Anese Sicilian. O and abbiamo, I have or we have, in Sicilian instead is io and avviamo. I know or we know, so sappiamo becomes zaccio or sappiamo. To be or we are is sto or stamo, but in Sicilian stio or stamo. And then the present progressive verb, I am coming, sto venendo in Italian, stai venendo in Sicilian. You can see how the D and the N become a double N instead. The D drops out, but the N is doubled to make up for the missing D. I love that language. To me, hearing stai venendo or sappiamo or potiamo, che ci potremmo fare? My parents always would say, what can you do? I love hearing it. Looking at Italian, Sicilian, and Spanish, we see some similarities and some differences again. And when I traveled in Sicily, I was there just for 2 weeks, but I that was when it convinced me that Sicilian is a language as opposed to a dialect. It is as different from Italian as Spanish is. And I know some Spanish. My wife and I speak it often at home. But my knowledge of a little bit of Italian, a little bit of Sicilian, compared to my knowledge of Spanish, helped me to understand the the argument that Sicilian really is a language. Now, it used to be backed by a political system. It is not anymore. Although recently the Sicilian parliament decided that Sicilian should be taught in the Sicilian schools. I don't think that that has taken place, and the larger national government over all of Italy is not promoting Sicilian. So it really doesn't have much of a political backing today, but it used to. And what do you say about a language that used to have backing but doesn't anymore? Does it suddenly cease to be a language because it doesn't have that political backing? I don't think so. So to me, despite the slip of my tongue every once in a while when calling it Sicilian dialect, just because so many Americans will call it that, Sicilian really is a language. So looking at some of the differences between the three, we can see here, bello, birro, bello, galena, adena, gallina. The double L in Spanish takes as different an approach to the Italian double L as Sicilian does. If it becomes a double D in Sicilian, it becomes like a Y or sometimes a J, depending on your Spanish accent. So it's just as different from Italian as Sicilian is. Folla, food, and multitude. That's pretty different. For a breadcrumb, we have molleca, mudrica, and mendrugos. I remember during our visit to Sicily, one of the relatives asked me how I said breadcrumbs, and I told her mudrica, and she just got such a kick out of that, and she would imitate me for the next few days, mudrica, because she hadn't heard that dialect or that accent in so long. We already talked about anche or me too, or puri or y puro, and yo también in Spanish. And the word to buy, the word to go. And here we see again what I think of as a lot of Spanish influence in Sicilian. And how could it not be? The Spanish were there for 500 years. And even in terms of the pronouns, it seems like the Spanish and the Sicilian are a little closer than the Sicilian and the Italian are. In many cases, Sicilian and Italian are closer, but in some cases, Spanish and Sicilian are closer, as as we see here with nuati voati versus nosotros vosotros. You can also see here in idro, idra, and id for him, her, and them in Sicilian that it seems to be derived not from Italian but from Spanish. If you take these Spanish words like ella and you Sicilianize it, the E becomes an I, the double L becomes a double D, and all of a sudden you have ida instead of ella. And the same thing with id and eos. You take the E becomes an I in Sicilian, the double L becomes a double D, and most Italian Sicilian words are not going to end in S like they do in Spanish. They're going to pluralize with an I or an E at the end instead. So from eos you have id. It makes total sense. Of course, in Inese it's verde instead of id. Again, one of the Spanish influences that I see is with the word un in Sicilian, that it seems to be derived from the word donde instead of dove. It's taking the nd, and since it obliterates the d, it's going to double the n. And then lastly, looking at the word for I am suffering, which I heard all the time, stai soffrendo, that it seems more closely aligned to the Spanish than it does to the Italian. The similarity between Spanish estoy sufriendo and Sicilian stai sufriendo, is just too tantalizingly close. Lastly, I wanted to look at a few Sicilianisms. Growing up, it took me years to suddenly understand why there was a different word for with in different foods that we grew up with. Like sometimes we would have basta cuzuco on Sundays, or on a weekday night we would have basta casarsa, and every blue moon or so, we would have basta chizzardi, which is one of Sicily's hallmark dishes, which is of Arabic origin, with currants and sardines and fennel. Very interesting. It sounds like a horrible combo, but it's really very good. All of a sudden, as an adult, it dawned on me that whatever was the ending of the word before the word for con el matched the word for cone. So zuoko ends with an O, so cone ends with a U. So cone ends with a U as well. Kuzuoko. Zarsa or salsa ends with an A, and so does the word for cone. So kazarsa. And zardi ends with an I, and the word for cone ends with an I as well. Kizardi. it's just such a neat thing. Italian, Spanish, they don't have that. Sicilian does, and I think it's one of the things that makes it so interesting. And its own language. It is so much its own. And lastly, I wanted to cover a little bit about diminutives and augmentatives, which I grew up hearing my whole life, and I just love them. Like, how do you say little Salvatore? It's Toreador. And Toreador is even one of the characters in a Sicilian opera, Cavalleria Rusticana, which was one of my parents' favorites growing up. Or how do you say big Conchetta? Apparently, we had a relative, she was long gone by the time I was born, who was big, and her name was Conchetta, so she was called Concettona. How do you say little bird? Not just uccido, but occidozzo. And my aunt and my mother loved that word. She said they grew up always hearing that word, occidozzo. And lastly, big fountain is fontanazza. Regular fountain is fontana, and a big fountain is a fontanazza. We even had some very dear relatives with that last name. And as an adult, when I started to understand Italian, Spanish, and Sicilian, I could figure out what that meant, that it meant big fountain. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I sure did. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about Sicily and Sicilian and my impressions of that place and that language. Thank you.